Hello everybody, it's Sarah, and today is finally the day that I am sitting down to film a video that I have been planning or intending to film off and on for a couple of years now, but where about 2 months ago I read a book that made me decide, you know what, I want to make things more concrete and I actually want to sit down and film this video. However, then in the past 2 months a lot of things came in between, work, uni and so on, so it took me until now to actually go sit down and film this video. And the video that I am talking about is me talking about sexual violence in fantasy and how it is used in fantasy and my issues around that. So yeah, this is going to be a hard video. This is going to be quite a serious video. I want to have some content warnings, content notes right out front. If sexual violence, sexual assault, anything surrounding that is a difficult topic for you, although I don't think it's an easy topic for anyone, but you know, if it's a particularly difficult topic for you and if it's something that potentially can trigger you, then please click off this video, do not continue on. I want you to take care of yourself first before watching any videos of mine. The other thing that I wanted to mention also is that this video, as all of my videos, are not scripted. I don't really have any specific things that I want to talk about. I just generally want to talk about my thoughts and feelings surrounding this topic. I do think when it comes to sexual violence in fantasy that there are certain guidelines that authors maybe should consider before they put sexual violence in their books, but obviously there's no hard and fast rules because as readers and as authors we are all different and we all have, you know, different levels of what we think is okay. I think there's black zones within sexual violence. There's instances in which I'm like, this should never be used like that. But there's also a lot of gray zones. So what I'm going to do in this video is I mostly have examples of books that use sexual violence or that have sexual violence within them. I'm going to talk about how they are used within the story, within the characters, within the writing. And then I am going to talk about whether I think it was okay the way the author implemented it or whether I didn't think it was okay the way the author implemented it, and through that just kind of explain my thought process to when it comes to sexual violence in fantasy. Because I am going to use specific books, there will be spoilers for those books, although those spoilers won't be, you know, larger plot arc spoilers, but more so just, you know, there is sexual violence in those books and this is the character that it happens to, maybe. I'm not really sure if I'm gonna mention the specific characters because if you don't know the book and you don't know the character then it won't make any difference to you anyway, but you know, there will be slight spoilers for these books in this video. And so with that said, the thing that I want to start with is, I think, actually a specific comment, and that's why I'm looking down right now, I have my phone right here, is a specific comment that I got on the video that was a rant for the book that originally finally motivated me to sit down and film this video. The book that I'm talking about, and I will talk about it more later on, is The 11th Cycle by Kian and Ardalan. And when I talked about this book, when I talked about it in my review, I really made it clear that the rape scene that was in this book really was the thing that broke the camel's back, the straw that broke the camel's back for me, because it was absolutely unnecessary. And something that I also mentioned, I will talk more about this rape scene later on because I do think it's a very perfect example of what not to do. But something that I said while talking about that rape scene is that my issue with the rape scene wasn't necessarily that it was graphic or that it was too much for me, that I am incredibly sensitive when it comes to sexual assault and sexual violence and fantasy, although I do think it's too graphic, but I'll get to my thoughts on that later on as well. And the reason why I can say it has nothing to do with me being too sensitive or being, you know, easily triggered. Sexual violence is not something that necessarily easily triggers me in books. So it doesn't really have anything to do with me being sensitive. I've read plenty of books with sexual violence in them where I had no issue with the sexual violence being used. and I'll get to those examples as well. So I got a comment, or part of a comment that I got was, you say you're not sensitive, but if you think that a sexual violence scene should never be included in a book solely for world building purposes, then you are being sensitive. You're advocating for removing one topic over another purely for reasons that it offends you. That's pretty much the definition of being sensitive. So let's talk about it. Can sexual violence ever be used in a way in a book where it's just there for world building or just there for plot reasons? For me personally, no. For me, it adds absolutely nothing to the story. I get that there's people who don't mind that, who are absolutely not bothered by that, but those people I have discovered are usually men who themselves have never had to experience the helplessness that comes from being sexually assaulted. I personally, full disclosure, I am one of the lucky women where the worst thing that has ever happened to me in terms of sexual assault is that I've been publicly groped on the street out of nowhere. By the way, that was in bright daylight, so not even at night or anything, and I think that just already kind of shows you where I'm coming from, where I'm like, I'm one of the few lucky women who has never had to deal with more. So I just find it a little bit insensitive, actually, like the other end of the spectrum, not neutral, but insensitive, when someone who does not have to live with the fear that women have to live with often in their daily lives, or people who present as feminine to society, and also trans people, and obviously a lot of other marginalized groups as well that will be more likely to be sexually assaulted in the course of their lives. When someone who does not have to live with the daily fear then comes to the video of someone who does live with that daily fear, and is like, well, you're being sensitive if you're saying that sexual violence can't be used simply for world building purposes. I mean, sure, to a certain degree, I guess it can be used to world building purposes, but if you make that decision as an author, you have to be conscious that by you making that decision, your book automatically, to a certain degree, will become less accessible to a big subset of fantasy readers. That you make the conscious decision that your target audience will be mostly cis men, probably white cis men, probably able-bodied white cis straight men, and that automatically your book will have a lot less interest to any other readers. And that's something that I also want to make clear. When I talk about something being problematic, I'm not necessarily talking about authors not being allowed to write that. I think authors generally are allowed to write whatever they want, really. However, as a writer, you still kind of have to be conscious a little bit where you might perpetuate harm to your readers. And also, as an author, you have to be conscious that what you write is gonna have consequences as to who your readership is going to be. So when I'm talking in this video about this is where I think sexual assault is implemented in a good way or in a bad way, or sexual violence, I'm not talking about this is how authors are allowed to write it and this is how authors are not allowed to write it. What I'm talking about is this is just something to consider, what I'm saying. And so let's start with the thing that he said first, world building. Should sexual violence be part of the world building? In my opinion, no. In my opinion, there's plenty of ways to make a story grim and to make clear that the world that you're building is a very, very dark place without casual sexual violence to women. And I'm gonna bring up the first example right here, A Song of Ice and Fire by George R. Martin. So I am, by the way, not going to use the show because I do think that the show in a way made it more gratuitous, like made the sexual violence more gratuitous and more voyeuristic than even the books did. However, I'm still gonna talk about the books in a negative way. I'm only specifically going to talk about the first book because I have not reread the other books yet, and it's been like 10 years since I read them. But all the yellow tabs that you see right here, which are a total of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 tabs, which technically doesn't sound that many, is instances where sexual violence is being told to happen to women, happens to women, or is being threatened upon women. This book is 800 pages long, minus the appendix. That is almost one instance of sexual violence against women per 100 pages. That is a lot. That is genuinely a lot. And while I do think, like, what I noticed on this reread, in the first book at least, what I do think is maybe not as bad as it could be, but you know, the bar is really fucking low with this one, is that I did notice that the sexual violence within the story is not quite as graphic as the other violence within the story. So when you just see people being killed, it's often a lot more violent than the sexual violence. However, I think part of the reason might also be that within the first book, most of the sexual violence that we see is stuff that we were told, or that we are told from another person's perspective. So it's not something that currently happens on page, but it's something that happens in the past. The one instance, obviously, that I have to mention that's just kind of weird, to be honest, is the honeymoon sex scene between Drogo and Dany, which, yeah, I don't want to talk about that scene because there's a whole lot of shit to unpack with that scene, to be honest. But yeah, generally speaking, the way it's done, I would say, is better than in other grimdark novels because it's not necessarily as graphic. However, the way that women just constantly have to fear for their lives is just, it's not comfortable. And maybe that's also something where I, as a woman, am like, I don't need that to be shown to me on paper. When you have a dark world, when you have a grimdark world, for me, the violence that women have to face on a sexual level is automatically already implied. I don't need to be told constantly how afraid women have to be. I don't need women to constantly be threatened with sexual violence to get that and to get that feeling. And I think maybe, once again, it's just that a lot of these authors have a very male audience in view, and men typically don't live with that fear. By the way, yes, I am talking a lot about sexual violence towards women right now. I do want to acknowledge, though, that sexual violence isn't something that only happens to women. Yes, statistically, it's something that is more likely to happen to women, and women are more often the victim of sexual violence. However, men can also be the victims of sexual violence, both of other men as well as of women, just as much as women can be the victims of sexual violence of women as well as of men. However, another thing also, statistics tell us, which obviously there's, you know, a lot of stuff with statistics around sexual violence because there's still a lot of shame around it, so a lot of people don't go to the police with it. But as far as the statistics that we have, men are more likely to be the perpetrators and women are more likely to be the victims of sexual violence. That does not mean that we can't also acknowledge that men are the victims of sexual violence and women are the perpetrators. However, and you will see that in the book that I will talk about as well, women are just also more likely to be depicted as the victims of sexual violence. So that's why I'm going to talk very much about being focused around women here. And also, once again, I want to acknowledge that it's not just women, but it's generally people who are perceived as women by society who are very likely to be the victims of sexual violence. And so, yes, that aside, once again, I forgot where I was with this book. But yeah, as I said, for me as a woman, if I have a grimdark world, I don't need a reminder every 100 pages that women are likely to experience sexual violence in this world. I already know it. I already have it intrinsically in my blood, in the way I was socialized, because that's the way women have to be socialized in our society today. We have to be socialized in a way where we're aware that at every second of the day, potentially we could be assaulted. And so I think, once again, having this many reminders, it's not for your female audience. It's just for your male audience. And it just caters towards your male audience, because your male audience has to be reminded how hard women have it in this world. Your male audience probably isn't the type of audience that already is aware of what women face in a grimdark world. Because if we want it or not, in my opinion, we live in a grimdark world. So yeah, that's the first point, and that's why I personally do not think sexual violence is a necessary part for world building just on its own to show how horrible the world is. Because we already know. We genuinely already know. So next, my second negative example comes from, I forgot what the first book was called. I think The Dark Queen Rises by Raymond E. Feist, which was the first book in the Serpent War series. I, after this first book, decided to not continue on with the rest of the series, once again because of the sexual assault. Because what happened was that there was the inciting incident that you often get in a story. You have our main hero and he has this female childhood friend. Our young hero is probably the bastard gat of the Baron, and so one day the actual, legitimate sons of the Baron are out riding and they happen upon our hero's childhood friend and they rape her. Our hero obviously comes across the scene and he kills one of the sons of the Baron, and for that he ends up being exiled and being sent to the army, and he has to go off and fight in some war. So first of all, we just have the rape for plot reasons, for inciting incident reasons. The female childhood friend in this first book does not appear again after the scene. We do not know what happened to her. We do not know how she feels. She is not at all centered in her own sexual assault within the narrative. She is just there as a plot point for our main hero. And then that would have been bad enough, but later on our hero has sex for the first time with a prostitute and it just awakens all his sexual instincts in him or something. And while he's lying in his, I don't know, bed sheets or whatever, he remembers that rape scene of his childhood best friend. However, he does not remember how horrible it was. He does not remember the righteous anger that he felt at seeing her so helpless. No, what he remembers is how supple her breasts looked. What he remembers is the absolutely gorgeous contrast between the red of the blood and her white thighs. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is why I do not read Raymond E. Feist, and the only exception was the Empire trilogy, because he co-wrote that with Jenny Wirtz, and I still believe that he did not have a lot to do with that, even though sources say otherwise. But yeah. So we have 2 points right here, like right away. First of all, can we just agree that, fridging is bad enough as it is? It's just, not even from a sexism, misogyny point of view, but fridging is just a lot of times lazy storytelling. I mean, you can kill or have something horrible happen to characters to, incite our main character or just, push our main character in a certain direction. But generally speaking, fridging is lazy storytelling. There's a way you can subvert it and you can have it done really well, but generally speaking, it's lazy storytelling, and a lot of times we don't feel bad because, it happens a lot of times at the very beginning of the story, and it just, yeah. I'm not a fan of fridging. But to not just fridge a character, but to just have a character go through some of the worst violence that a character can go through, that a person can go through, that attacks not just your body, but your innermost self in a way that a lot of other things don't, and then just brush over that and completely ignore what happened to that character is just terrible, to be honest. But then also to retroactively make it even more voyeuristic than the scene already was. And that's just the thing. Some dude bros on the internet will go out there and be like, well, actually it's men who have to suffer the most violence in fantasy stories. Because, you know, it's men who are constantly killed and in war and, you know, they're maimed and whatever. But read fantasy stories. Read fantasy stories and you will notice that when men are threatened with violence, or not sexual violence, just any violence. When men are threatened with any violence, also including sexual violence, by the way, when men are the ones that, you know, have to deal with violence or that are attacked. Actually, I gotta apply a few more descriptors. When men, mostly characters that are cis, straight, able-bodied, and usually white, but that kind of depends on who is writing the story. When those types of men come across violence in fantasy stories, the way that violence is written might be graphic, but it is in no way as gratuitous and as voyeuristic as when women suffer violence, when disabled bodies suffer violence, when non-white bodies suffer violence, when queer bodies suffer violence. In stories specifically written often by white cishet men. And maybe you have to be someone who in some ways marginalized to notice the difference in the descriptions of those scenes. But they are so different, I guarantee you that. So no, even though men suffer the most violence in fantasy stories, they suffer violence differently than anyone else in a fantasy story. And I am sick and tired of graphic voyeuristic rape scenes that aren't there to push the plot along, that aren't there to push the story along, to push the character along, but they are written in that graphic, just disgusting way, simply for the titillation of the male readership. That's it. And I would like to know if those same readers, when characters that they feel like they can relate to and that they can see themselves in or that they can inspire to be like, what their reaction would be if those type of characters encounter violence in the way all other characters do in fantasy stories. So, yeah. I don't like voyeuristic and graphic rape scenes. I think if you're a good writer, you can very easily write a shocking rape scene, a shocking and impactful rape scene that, you know, is done in a way where I would appreciate it, which I'll get to later on, what I appreciate or when I appreciate a rape scene. That's so weird to say. You know what I mean, I hope. I'll get to the positive examples later on. But yeah, I don't think those types of scenes 99% of the time need to be graphic. But continuing on with graphic scenes, and I might have to split this video into two because I have to leave in 8 minutes. So I'm just gonna continue talking about the last negative example and then I will come back in the evening and continue on. But the last one obviously is the 11th cycle by Kian and Ardalan. The scene that we have here, and once again spoilers here, we have one of our POV characters who about halfway through the book becomes disabled. She loses an arm and a leg. And then she is slowly on her way to, you know, find herself again and kind of be okay with the body that she lives in right now. She starts training again, she starts being happy again. Then comes a scene where she is absolutely humiliated before her entire religious community and she runs off from this kind of mass type thing. And she runs into the woods where she is set upon by two men who end up raping her and cutting off her remaining limbs. This scene was the scene where I was like, okay, I finally have to sit down and film this video, because I had talked to the author because I went to a signing previously, and he talked about it. He talked about trigger warnings. He also talked about trigger warnings towards sexual violence. He kind of put sexual violence and sexual content into a pot, which I'm not quite okay with, but if you want to know all about that, watch my rant review. I will leave it linked down below. But he talked about the trigger warnings into sexual violence, and that there is instances of sexual violence in this story. However, that it was so important to him to not have gratuitous sexual violence, because he knows that that's a problem within fantasy, especially grimdark fantasy, that women in the stories often have to suffer sexual violence. And after that, I went into this book so hopeful, and he also said that he had female friends who read the book who were like, no, well, I didn't like the scene and I had to stop after the scene because it was so hard to read, but I think the scene is necessary. And once again, either it's an instance that just proves that different people have different awarenesses, or different, you know, bars where they set their bars. Although once again, I don't consider myself someone who is very sensitive when it comes to the contents of sexual violence. Like, just because something is graphic won't be the reason why I dislike a sexual violence scene. I mean, I just said that I don't think, generally speaking, that it's necessary to be graphic, but whatever. Or the other reason could be that maybe they didn't think that they could honestly tell him that the sexual violence scene wasn't necessary. In my opinion, it's just one of those examples where a sexual violence scene leads to nothing. It is overly graphic. First of all, it didn't need to be that graphic. Like, I felt like the way it was described was once again described completely different from any other violence in the story. And generally speaking, the body of this disabled person was just described in a way where it was just different from other bodies in the story. So it was just weird off the bat. But aside from that, that rape scene added nothing. It added nothing to the world building. I already knew it was a brutal world. It added nothing to character development. The character was already pretty fucking angry beforehand, and the same character arc could have been done exactly the same way if the rape scene hadn't happened. And then lastly, the rape wasn't properly processed within the story and within the character. The character never really contents with, after this point, with what had happened to her. Like, there was a lot of introspection before that. There was a lot of introspection in terms of that character, what had happened to her when she lost her first two limbs. But after that point, she becomes catatonic, which very, very understandable that she becomes catatonic, and then it's all out for revenge. And possibly in the future we will see the character having to contend with what happened to her, but within this book none of that happened, and I'm not interested in reading the future books, so you know, I honestly do not care. And that's kind of the perfect way to get into, you know, when do I think rape scenes, sexual assault scenes, sexual violence is warranted in fantasy? Because I just said I don't want it for the world building. I don't want it for shock factor because it's specifically graphic. I don't want it for just character development, to be honest, as well. I mean, it didn't happen here, but if the only reason your character is raped is because you need to show how strong that character is, then I don't think that's a good reason as well. So what do I think are good reasons within fantasy to use sexual violence? And this is gonna sound very counterintuitive to everything that I said right now, but the reasons when I think that sexual violence should be used in fantasy or in any story really. I'm talking about fantasy in this video, but obviously a lot of the things that I say can be applied to other genres as well. But the times when sexual violence should be used is for the sake of itself. What do I mean with that? I'll tell you that once I come back, but now I'm going out to get bubble tea. I'm gonna get in a good mood again, and I'll see you later. And I am back, so let's continue on. So now we're gonna be continuing on with some few exceptions. I still have 2 negative examples, but we're gonna continue on to some books where there was sexual violence in those books, but in my personal opinion, it was handled quite well. And let's first of all start with this book right here, because I think this series is a series that shows exceptionally well that talking about sexual violence and tackling sexual violence doesn't need to be something that is only done in adult fantasy books or in adult books, but that you can tackle sexual violence and the repercussions of experiencing sexual violence in a way that is, first of all, suitable for younger readers, and which personally, from my point of view, shows perfectly that how hard something hits, especially when it comes to sexual violence, doesn't have anything to do with how graphic it is. And the series I'm talking about is the Girls of Paper and Fire series by Natasha Gnan, which is a YA high fantasy series. And in this series, the setup of this series is that our main character is brought to the palace to become one of a number of concubines to the king. And as such, you know, she has to serve the king in certain ways, and it's the setup of the story. This is a YA series again, so there's nothing really too graphic in terms of the sexual violence. However, it is still made very clear what happens to her, why it happens to her, and the repercussions it has on her. And those repercussions are felt by her until the 3rd book. Like, in terms of a series, it's YA. I had fun with it. I really enjoyed the 1st book when I first read it. I didn't really like the 2nd book. I enjoyed the 1st book when I read it at the beginning of this year again. But generally speaking, it's YA. I'm not necessarily a YA reader. However, the way the sexual violence is tackled in this story is better than many adult fantasy books that I have read. And it has nothing to do with how graphic it can or can't be, and it has everything to do with how seriously it is taken, and with centering the main character, with centering not just the main character, all the characters that have gone through this. Because again, she's not the only concubine to the king. They deal with it and they handle it in very different ways, and they are all taken seriously. There's no one right way to react to this trauma that has happened to them. All of them are valid, and the feelings of all of them are valid. And so personally, I don't really have that much to say in how exactly it's handled within this book that makes it so great, because it's handled similarly to other books I want to talk about. But I just wanted to hold this up as an example of showing graphic doesn't necessarily equate impactful. And I think personally, if you put something like sexual violence in your book, you need to do it consciously, and you probably as a writer want it to be impactful. And sadly, too many writers think impactful equals shock factor equals as shocking as possible and as graphic as possible, and that's just not the case. Then I have an example of one author that just shows that the same author doesn't necessarily have to do it right all the time, to be honest. Because I am now going to talk about my favorite author growing up, and the first series that I want to talk about, I think, is one of the main series that I would hold up as, if you want to include sexual violence in your book, this is how to do it. Because, or at least in a lot of cases, this is how to do it, because this just perfectly exemplifies the thing that I ended with saying, because I feel like I might have started it up again a little bit differently than I just ended earlier because I did not know exactly what my last sentence was anymore. But the thing that I was saying about include sexual violence for the sake of itself and have it not be there to serve something else. And the series that I would say is a good example for that is the Black Xual series by M. Bishop, because pretty much every single character, like every POV character at least, except for one POV character, also the main character, who interestingly is not a POV character, and also a ton of the side characters, like most of the characters in the series that we follow for a longer time and that play a more major role within the series, have been victims of sexual violence. Two of our characters are about 1,700 years old, and for most of the time they have been used as sex slaves. Another one of our main character was first raped when she was 12 years old and who has since lived her life as a prostitute. And also she has turned it into another profession, being an assassin, so she uses being a prostitute to get to her victims, and she kind of tries to get people back like that. And then also our main character that is not a POV character, the character that is at the center of everything really, also has been the victim of sexualized violence since she was about 7 years old and was raped when she was 12 years old as well. And so you follow those characters, and the trauma that they have gone through is such an intricate part of who they are. So it's not just something where it's like showing how strong they are. No, a lot of times it's their weakness. They get triggered multiple times throughout the series. They do stupid shit because of what they have gone through, because of the trauma they have gone through, because it just triggers something in them where just every thought is just gone and they go to a level where they simply react. So first of all, the trauma is just an intricate part of themselves. Also, the sexual violence here in a way is part of the world building, and I will talk about that with another series as well, where I feel like the sexual violence is in a way part of the world building, but in a way where it's not just used to show how dark the world is. In this society, something has gone tremendously wrong, where it's just turned into this vicious cycle where women try and hurt men to feel stronger, and men try and hurt women to make them weaker. It's kind of hard to explain because it's a whole thing with the world building, and I would have to explain the entire world building. But the reason why I'm not as bothered here with how it is because first of all, it's not just used to show how dark it is, but with the way it's just tied to the lives of the characters, it just manages to not just be there to be graphic or to be shocking or to be horrible, but it's there for the sake of itself, and it's there for the characters, and it just is such an intricate part where you couldn't take this part away from the world building and it'd still be the same. For A Song of Ice and Fire, if I took away the rape and the sexual violence against women, it would still be the same dark world, to be honest. It wouldn't change much. The story wouldn't change. This story would change in its foundations. And I feel like that's a lot of times the case when rape is just used as a shock value or just to show how dark it is. It's not really bound to the story in any way. It's there just because the author wanted to add it and they didn't think of how it plays into the story. And so if you take away the rape, nothing would change about the story. Nothing would change about the world. And so that's what I mean, kind of include sexual violence for the sake of itself. I hope it makes sense. It like really makes sense in my brain, but I feel like I'm not quite finding the words to put across what I exactly mean with it. Also, something that I did quote unquote appreciate in this series is that women and men are the victims of sexual violence just the same. Like, everyone can be the victim of sexual violence, and it's treated the same. It's treated with the same worth. It's treated with the same trauma. it's just, there's no difference made. I mean, there are in some ways differences, just as a kind of mirror to our society, but at the same time, I have never read a book where it wasn't just women being the main victims of sexual violence. And I read this way too early, to be honest. I read this when I was 12. But as I got older, I really started to appreciate that. And something that kind of put that into perspective as well, and it kind of comes back to the thing I was saying earlier, how some characters or characters who have certain characteristics are just way more likely to, I don't know, be described in a certain way, but then on the other hand, like the other side of the coin is their pain is then often not taken as seriously, or it's just handled in a way to further a different character's growth. And an example for that would be the Outlander series. I have only read the first book, but I stopped after the first book, and this was once again part of the reason, because our main character Claire, I don't think she is raped, but it's not framed as rape, but I don't think she is in a situation where the situation is framed as rape at any point in the first book. However, there are multiple situations where she's almost raped. And there are at least one, I think actually multiple situations where I personally would say she was raped, because Jamie, the main love interest, the male love interest, forces himself on her. But it's not framed as rape because in the end she ends up enjoying it. So, you know. Isn't that something we've heard before? However, by the end of the story, Jamie himself is also raped. And the difference in the framing of the two characters is just astonishing, because Jamie's trauma is taken so seriously and is focused on so much, whereas the multiple times that Claire was almost raped / was raped by her husband at the time, we just breeze past those. And it's just something that is so annoying. And I know that especially for men it is hard in the real world, because they often get taken even less seriously than women when they go out and say they have been raped. At least when they have been raped by a woman. But in fiction we see it the other way around a lot of times, and so that is just something that I really appreciate about this one, because you have men who are raped, you have women who are raped, and it's handled in the same way. The repercussions are the same. And again, in the series, the sexual violence isn't just a one-off that then maybe for a little bit is handled as a trauma. No, you have books that are set decades or centuries past the stuff that happens to these characters. And then something happens that triggers them and that puts them off, and they are right back at square one. Yes, they get better. Yes, they improve. Yes, they work on improving themselves and on getting better in their mind and on overcoming the trauma. But at the same time, you can't 100% overcome this trauma. In a way, it still is sleeping inside of them, and the wrong trigger sets them off. So yeah, that's something that I just really appreciate about this series. But same author, negative example in Wild Country, which is a book in the other series, for example. It's one of the side books, like the side stories. I think there's a sexual assault, even though it's not graphic. It's a scene where a body is found dead after the fact, and that body has obviously gone through sexual violence, or sexual violence has been suffered by this person. But the way it's done is that character is kind of the bitch type character, and the way it feels like is that this character was punished by the violence that happened to her. And that's also something I just wanted to mention that really quickly. Authors don't get it right all the time, and authors sometimes do stupid shit, even though they wrote a whole other series beforehand where they handle it with so much care. But yeah, so just wanted to mention that. So I have two more books. Another story where I think it's just very exemplified what I mean with sexual violence should be in a story for the sake of itself is Tuliper Thorne by Ava Reid. I know that Ava Reid got a lot of criticism because a lot of people thought that the sexual content and the sexual violence in this book was too gratuitous and graphic, which I personally don't get. I didn't see this story as graphic, but once again, that's just an example of readers will be different, and that's also where I'm like, okay, I think all authors should consider what they're writing in their stories and how the narrative is framed around the sexual violence, what they might imply with how the sexual violence is implemented in their stories. But I can't really say that an author should never include sexual violence in their stories. I wouldn't even want that, because Ava Reid, while this book was published, talked a lot about not exactly how sexual violence happened to them. I believe Ava Reid might be a non-binary author. Ava Reid talked a lot about being a survivor, and so this book kind of also was a little bit of working through their trauma. And so I wouldn't want to take that away from an author, but I also think just because a story is own voices doesn't necessarily mean that it can't ever be harmful to a certain community. So yeah, it's just, once again, there's no black and white things. But the thing where I think it's really well done in the story is this entire story is about trauma, and it's about family trauma, and it's about the trauma of our main character. And the sexual violence that happened to that main character, the sexual violence that was, I'm constantly trying to think of the word, that was committed on them? I don't know. But the sexual violence in their past is just an integral part of the trauma, and so you couldn't really leave it out, and it's an integral part of the story, and the story would fundamentally change if you left it out. It's not just that some plot points would have to be, you know, moved around or something, or you'd have to find something else instead to be an inciting incident or whatever, or to show how strong a character is. No, the entire story would change, and that's something, obviously, it's once again subjective, what is 100% necessary for the story. But in this case, for me, it absolutely was. It would be a fundamentally different story. One of the layers would be gone, because obviously all the other layers with the family trauma would still be there. But in terms of how this character was used and what she was used for, also by her family, that would completely change. And so yeah, that's why I personally think this is a great book. Also, once again, I do think that it's not that graphic. I think something that is very well done in this story as well is there is no penetrative sexual violence. Regardless, it's still a very debilitating and traumatizing situation that this character is in. And so this story shows you don't always have to go all the way. You don't always have to do the do. It's just, there's so many ways to do sexual violence well, and to do it carefully and be considerate of who the reader might be, of who the characters are, of what the story is. I don't get it why men always keep getting it wrong. Sometimes also women, quite a few times also women, but men 9 times out of 10 get it wrong, and I don't get it why. Is it really just how we as people who are perceived as women are socialized, how we walk through the world, how aware we are of the danger we are in constantly, that just makes us automatically more careful when writing? I don't know. Anyway, on to the last book. So the last book I want to talk about is the Xual series, or Xual's Legacy, by Jacqueline Carey. For this series, I need to provide a little bit of context, and that is that our main character has this thing where she is forced to feel pain as pleasure. So whenever she hurts herself or anything, she feels that as pleasure, and she is physically aroused by that. Our main character also happens to be a courtesan spy, so she sells her body for money. She is a prostitute, basically a high-end prostitute. However, she also kind of spies for the person who holds her bond, and then later on for the royal family. Why do I want to talk about this book specifically? I think once again, it just shows the nuances of sexual violence and how sexual violence doesn't necessarily always have to be something negative in a story, and how sexual violence can be used in a very thoughtful way to build a character, to build like the context around a character. And if it's used in the right way, and if it's used with consideration, and if it's used with consideration to the character going through it, and if it's then not just set aside once it's too much, then it can be a really important part of a story. So Phaedra, our main character, is basically a prostitute, and this series I often describe as a series where when you have a layer of violence over everything in A Song of Ice and Fire, you have a layer of sensuality over everything in the Kushiel's Legacy trilogy. Phaedra is a prostitute. She is a prostitute who enjoys pain. She is a masochist. She's basically a magical masochist. It's what it is. There's no other way to put it. And so we get a few sex scenes throughout the series where Phaedra enjoys her body being beaten and being hurt. However, those are scenes where she goes into them of her own volition. Yes, she's paid for the sex, but she goes into them and she enjoys herself. And in the series there are two situations where Phaedra is in a situation, maybe three situations, where Phaedra, I would say, suffers sexual violence. One is kind of on the line because it is a situation with a massive power imbalance. However, it is a situation where Phaedra knows if she says her safe word, everything will stop. So it's a very interesting situation. I do think it's like on the border to being rape, and it's not a great situation, it's not a great sex scene, and Phaedra suffers from it. It's not quite rape. However, there are two situations where Phaedra is definitely raped. In both cases, she is in the custody of another character. So there are two situations where Phaedra is in the custody of a character who repeatedly has sex with her, or with whom she repeatedly has sex. The first one is in the first book, and interestingly, as far as the sex that Phaedra has on page in the entirety of the first book, or that we know she has in the first book, it is the least violent, the least surface level violent. However, the narrative makes it so clear that while on the surface the other stuff was way more violent, and while Phaedra, because of who she is, because of this magical thing that she has, while she still physically enjoys herself, that thing is rape. And she has to deal with that, and she has to handle the repercussions of that after she gets out of the situation. So you have a book that manages to have very, very brutal sex scenes, BDSM sex scenes, and yet it's not those scenes that are depicted as rape, because those scenes aren't rape. Those are situations where she feels safe, where she is safe, she has a safe word, she put herself into that situation, she enjoys herself. In the other situation, maybe her body, because it has no other choice, enjoys itself as well. However, she as a person is suffering, and that is made very clear. And then in the third book, I believe we do have rape scenes where the scenes are very brutal, and it's very much BDSM and on the darker side of BDSM, but once again, Phaedra's body enjoys itself because it has no other choice. However, the narrative, even though we are told that Phaedra's body enjoys itself, we are told by the narrative without a doubt that what she is going through is rape and it's sexual violence. And it's something that she has to work through a lot afterwards. Once again, we're at this thing where if you have sexual violence in your story, don't just have it be a plot point, have it be something that has a lasting consequence on the characters, not just physically, emotionally, traumatically, has a consequence on the character. And something else that I discovered in this book, that once again, we're going back to, does rape or does sexual violence have to be graphic? Something that I had in this book a lot, or that I at least had the impression in this book, is that the sexual violence, the sex scenes, were way less graphic than all other sex scenes. I mean, I wouldn't say that there were overly graphic scenes at all in the series. I mean, they're not fade to black. Most of the scenes aren't fade to black, but they're also not described in very graphic ways. The writing in general is very poetic, so that just kind of translates to the sex scenes. However, with the sexual violence and with the rape scenes, we are told a lot less information of what happens action for action, and a lot of times it's fade to black, or we check back in with Phaedra right after the fact. So yeah, that's just once again an example. I don't think, I'm just at the end of the video now, it's been over an hour anyway. I don't think that I necessarily can tell you point for point what do I think makes a positive sexual violence scene or a sexual violence scene that is okay, and what makes a sexual violence scene not okay for me, because a lot of it just comes down to so many different elements: framing, description, the use within the story, the use within the world building, the use within a character arc. However, as I said, for me, I think the simplest way I can say it, it just should be there for the sake of itself. And with that, I don't mean just put a rape scene in there so you can put a rape scene in there. For the sake of itself means something different for me. And I hope with me talking about the positive examples that I have, I made that a little bit clearer what that means for me. Ultimately, I just wish that most male authors would stop writing sexual violence committed upon women or upon people perceived as female, because it's just, yeah, they rarely do it well, and the few times that they do it well is just not worth it for me. So yeah, I think that was it for this video. This was long enough already. I filmed, I think, 1.5 hours. Let's see how long this video will end up being. And yeah, I won't ask you if you enjoyed this video, but you know, if you appreciated this video, maybe think of giving me a thumbs up. Also maybe subscribing. If you have any thoughts on the stuff that I talked about, leave it in the comments down below. And all the links to my social media, as well as to my book club of Queens, Witches and Valkyries, where I read one adult high fantasy book written by a woman or genderqueer person per month, will be left linked down below as well. So go and check those out, and I hope I'll see you soon. Bye!